Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we're diving into something really interesting, the protein gap in the Indian diet. I've got some fascinating excerpts from a podcast all queued up, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a topic that really goes beyond just the food on our plates, you know.
hmm
We're talking about cultural norms, economic factors, and even the science behind how our bodies use the nutrients we consume. It's fascinating stuff.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. This podcast jumps right in, calling protein the building block of life. Why is protein so crucial for our bodies?
Well, it's involved in almost every bodily function. We always hear about muscle building, right? And while that's true, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Protein is essential for things like repairing tissues, keeping our immune system strong. It even impacts our brain function and mood.
It's like the ultimate multitasker of nutrients. We need it for everything. But here's where things get interesting. It seems a significant portion of the Indian population might not be getting enough of it. What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, the podcast cites data from the Indian Council of Medical Research, and their findings are quite striking. They state that the average adult needs between zero point 0.8 and 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight each day. However, their research shows that the average intake among Indian adults is closer to zero point 0.6 grams. It's a big
Uh, zero
difference.
point 0.6 compared to almost a full gram. It makes you wonder, why is this gap so significant, especially considering how vital protein is for our well-being? Is it simply a matter of not eating enough protein-rich foods?
You know, it's actually a bit more complex than that. While the amount of protein we eat is important, the podcast stresses this concept of bioavailability. Essentially, this refers to how effectively our bodies can absorb and use the protein from different foods.
Oh, okay, so it's not just about piling protein onto our plates, but understanding how our bodies make use of it. That's something I hadn't really considered. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? How does this bioavailability factor come into play with traditional Indian cuisine?
Sure, many traditional Indian dishes revolve around ingredients like rice, chapati, and lentils. Don't get me wrong, these are all nutritious and delicious foods. However, the protein they offer might not be as easily absorbed compared to some other sources.
So, even if someone is eating what seems like a good amount of protein from these sources, their body might not be reaping the full benefits.
Exactly. And this is especially important for those following vegetarian diets. The bioavailability of plant-based protein can be a crucial factor in ensuring they meet their daily requirements. The podcast also delves into something they call a perception problem when it comes to protein.
Now, that sounds intriguing. What kind of perception problem are we talking about?
Well, for a long time, protein has been incorrectly marketed as, a bodybuilder's nutrient. This misconception, as the podcast points out, has led many to believe that unless you're hitting the gym regularly, you don't need to worry too much about your protein intake.
That's like saying only marathon runners need to stay hydrated. We all need water, just like we all need protein. It sounds like this perception problem could be a major contributor to the protein gap, especially if people aren't prioritizing protein in their diets. So we've got this double whammy, right? This potential bioavailability issue with traditional foods, and then this myth that protein is only for bodybuilders. It's a bit concerning.
Yeah, it's definitely a multifaceted challenge. But the good news is, the podcast doesn't leave us hanging without some solutions. They actually tackle another big myth surrounding protein, the idea that high-quality protein is automatically expensive or difficult to find.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear because I think there's this common misconception that you need those fancy protein powders or really expensive ingredients to get enough protein.
Exactly. And while those options exist, they're not the only way. The podcast highlights a whole bunch of affordable protein-rich foods that are already common in Indian kitchens.
So it's more about being smart with what we already have, not a complete pantry overhaul. What are some of those key ingredients they talk about?
Well, they specifically mention soy, peanuts, different types of seeds, and even dairy products like paneer and milk as being budget-friendly and easy to find. The real hurdle, they say, is changing our mindset and incorporating these ingredients more often and creatively in our everyday meals.
It's like they're saying, hey, you've already got the tools for a protein-rich diet. You just might not be using them to their full potential.
Exactly. And that's where the podcast takes an interesting turn. They start talking about the differences between urban and rural settings when it comes to getting enough protein.
Right, that makes sense. Things like access to a variety of foods, awareness about nutrition, and economic factors probably all play a role. What were some of the observations they made about these differences?
They mentioned that while urban areas might have a wider range of food choices, including more readily available sources of protein, there's often a lack of awareness about the importance of protein and how to make it a regular part of your diet. It's like having all the ingredients, but not necessarily the knowledge or the motivation to use them effectively.
Like having a toolbox full of tools, but not knowing how to use them. So just having access isn't always the answer.
What about rural areas?
Well, in rural areas, they often face a different set of challenges. The availability and affordability of diverse, protein-rich foods can be more limited. And this highlights those systemic issues that factor into this protein gap, showing that it's not just about personal choices, but also about making sure everyone has equal access to nutritious food.
It's like this protein puzzle has different missing pieces depending on where you are in India. Hopefully, the podcast offers some solutions to address these complex issues.
Oh, they do. They shift into this hopeful discussion about practical steps that can be taken by individuals and by society as a whole to close this protein gap. And they're really big on emphasizing that it's not about pointing fingers, but working together to find solutions that last.
So let's talk solutions. What are some of their suggestions? One of their main recommendations is investing in public health campaigns that really hammer home the importance of adequate protein for everyone, not just athletes or bodybuilders. They stress that clearing up misinformation and raising awareness is crucial to changing people's behaviors and attitudes towards protein.
Knowledge is power, empowering people to make informed decisions about their diets. What else did they suggest?
They're also big on encouraging people to diversify their diets, to include a wider variety of those readily available protein sources. For example, they talk about incorporating lentils, chickpeas, paneer, milk, nuts more strategically into daily meals. They even highlighted how the traditional Indian thali, with its emphasis on variety, can actually be a great foundation for a balanced protein intake.
I love that. Taking something familiar and beloved and fine-tuning it to maximize its nutritional value. Now, what about addressing those accessibility and affordability challenges we talked about, especially in rural communities?
Right, and that's where systemic change is key.
Hmm.
They talk about the importance of promoting and supporting access to those budget-friendly protein sources like peanuts, roasted chana, and soy foods that are within reach for a larger portion of the population.
Making sure healthy choices aren't dictated by your budget is so important. Did they have any other large-scale solutions? They did. They mentioned something about using existing government programs.
Oh, absolutely. They were talking about integrating protein-rich foods into programs like midday meal programs for school kids and things like the public distribution system.
That makes a lot of sense, using that existing infrastructure to tackle those accessibility hurdles, especially for communities that might not have as many resources.
Right, exactly. And they even touched on a more, I guess you could say, cutting-edge concept, fortifying common foods with protein.
Like adding a protein boost to things we already eat.
Yeah, like flour, dairy products, that sort of thing.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's like sneaking in better nutrition. Now, you mentioned they brought in a nutritionist to wrap things up. What kind of insights did they share?
Well, the nutritionist really emphasized how protein deficiency, it's not just about our physical health. It goes beyond that.
We talked about muscle health and all, but what other, maybe less obvious ways can protein deficiencies show up?
They made a really interesting point about how not getting enough protein can affect things like your cognitive function, your energy levels, even your mental well-being.
It's like the brain's version of being hangry, that foggy, sluggish feeling when you haven't had enough.
Exactly. So it's not just about, building physical strength, but also supporting mental clarity, focus, your overall mood.
Absolutely. So it seems like we've covered a lot of ground here. What were the podcast's final thoughts on tackling this protein gap in India?
They wrapped up by saying that it really requires a multi-pronged approach. We have to consider cultural factors, economic realities, the social aspects.
It's like this is a systemic issue that requires a systemic response, one that goes beyond just telling people what to eat.
Exactly. It's about access, affordability, awareness, all working together.
Well said. I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. It's definitely a call to action for all of us.
It really is. Each of us has a role to play, whether it's our own choices, supporting policies, or even just talking about this more.
Because a healthier, happier India, that's something we can all get behind.
Absolutely.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much for diving into this with me. It's been eye-opening.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah.
A really important conversation to have.